Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing my reading wrap up for the month of March. Now for this particular video I'm actually going to be breaking my wrap up into fiction and non-fiction, so if you're more interested in the non-fiction I will leave a timestamp down below to when I start talking about that, because I have a fairly even split. And actually if I could include the books I read for the BookTube prize in this, I would have read overwhelmingly more non-fiction than fiction this month, which was just quite interesting in terms of as a reading landscape. I can't talk about those books yet. I will be releasing my video with all of those thoughts in the next few days hopefully. So we're going to start talking about the fiction, and I have 6 books in total to talk about today, and we're going to go in order of preference I feel today rather than chronologically. So the first book I'm going to talk about is The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. This is a gothic historical fiction set in the Victorian era, and I gave it 9 out of 10. It was absolutely fantastic. I listened to this on audiobook and I would really recommend that as a way of consuming Laura Purcell's writing in general, to be honest. The Silent Companions follows a story about our main character whose husband has died tragically young, and she is going back to his estate household that is in very much rural Britain, away from the city, and there's a bit of a scandal surrounding her. It's also mixed between that timeline and a future timeline where we know that some kind of horrible fire has happened to her and that she is a suspect in this fire, and it's about the 2 different timelines and her having an opportunity to tell her story to her psychiatrist. As the story develops, we find that in this house there is a mysterious wooden figurine that looks exactly like our main character, even though she hasn't been there, and this room has been locked for over 50 years. And as the story progresses, creepier and freakier things start to happen. I really enjoy Laura Purcell, and I think this is a particularly strong book of hers. I've read her other book, The Corset, and I'd say that this one, whilst weaker in writing style, was definitely stronger in terms of plot and characters. It had a real Doctor Who Weeping Angels meets Gothic Victorian England feel, and was very cool, so I definitely recommend it if you're looking for something a little bit spooky, a little bit women in black, a little bit creepy around the edges. The other non-fiction that I gave 9 out of 10 to was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is a very strange sci-fi novella that has definitely been doing the rounds on BookTube at the moment, and people are reacting to it in very different ways. I wish I could tell you about what the plot is, but it's really hard to articulate because the book does very little in terms of helping you understand the world that it's set in. We have 2 main operatives who are working on different sides of some kind of intergalactic multiverse battle of some sort. One is called Red and one is called Blue, and it's about their missions but also the letters that they write to each other, and it's a love story as it unfolds. It was gorgeous and hauntingly creepy and really just so much fun, and so difficult to kind of articulate what this book is trying to do. The worlds that it's building are weird and wonderful and have clearly defined rules within them, but the author has very little interest in making sure that you're up to speed with what's going on, so there's almost no exposition or explanation of the world at any real point. It's really just what you pick up from Blue and Red's discussion via these letters, and also from kind of the snippets of their missions that you get. The snippets themselves are only a couple of pages long, and it has no real interest in explaining to you what the big end goal is going to be, what the different powers are, what's at stake. There's nothing like that. It's just kind of an exercise in language and creativity and characters, and I absolutely adored it. I thought it was very cool, and was doing some really weird, interesting things. I know that this will definitely not be everybody's cup of tea. That is 100% the case, but I personally absolutely loved it, and I thought it was surprisingly really funny. There are some amazing wordplay bits in it that I won't talk about because I don't want to spoil anything, but it was very cool. Okay, the other 4 fiction books that I read in the month of March kind of fall into 2 major categories. So I read book 1 and book 2 of Anya Bast's Dark Magic series. Book 1 is called Wicked Enchantment, and book 2 I have here is Cruel Enchantment. This is a paranormal romance, and it's kind of set in a fae world. Anya Bast writes paranormal romance with a fair amount of smut and kind of erotica thrown in. I've read a decent number of her books, and I think that these are some of her weaker ones when it comes to just the characters in general. The vague world building is that there is light magic and dark magic, but all of magical creatures have been kind of trapped in one major territory or city by some kind of very religious cult who have their own powers external to this, and it's about the fae people trying to break out of this. I say it's about that. It's really not in the grand grand scheme of things, because like with many of the paranormal romance books out there, the plot is very much secondary to the characters and their relationships. Book 1 has a much stronger relationship personally, I think, in it. It is about two people coming together. There is a slight subterfuge in one part, but they kind of swiftly brush past it, and I really enjoyed their relationship. This one, book 2, I thought was a lot weaker. It in theory has like an enemies to lovers trope going on in it, but I thought it was very weak on both those counts. Both of them gave up their enemies stance very quickly, as is so often the case in enemies to lovers tropes, to be honest, and I felt like there was a lot at stake which they just never really discussed. Like, people brushed over things that really, in my eyes, would be deal breakers. It also has a lot of unnecessary discussions of like abuse and things that I don't think added anything to the storyline and nor were dealt with very well, so it really isn't Anya Bast's strongest one. I'd say if you're interested in her as a writer, her Elemental Magic series, which I think starts with Witch Blood or Witch Fury, I can't remember which one, pun not intended, I think it's just a much better storyline. Having said that, these are good fun, and I think in this current climate, fun, silly books that really aren't that particularly kind of heavy to read are ideal. So I'm definitely going to continue on this series because, like, why not? They really don't take very long to read. And the other two books that I read were book, I believe, 15 and 16 of the Animorphs series by A Applegate. This is a middle grade from the late 90s, early 2000s that I've been idly chipping off. There are about 60 in the series, so I'm getting there. I'm like, what, 15 to 20% of the way through now, I think. So yeah, essentially the Animorphs are 5 kids who have the ability to morph into animals once they have acquired their DNA. And they are in some kind of intergalactic battle with the Yeerks, who are the bad guys in this world. I won't go into too much detail. The Animorphs books very much follow this exact same format each time round, so they are consistently hitting those notes time and time again. They're playing around with a few different things, like the overarching character arcs are starting to develop. I think the Animorphs books, as again, if you've been around my channel for a while, you'll know already, I think they do a very good job of confronting some of the realities of what it would be like if there was a kind of tween/teenager actually at a war zone, in terms of the trauma that the kids go through, the experiences of nearly dying and all those kind of things. So I think it does a very good job of acknowledging those pressures, which I think a lot of YA, especially these days, doesn't do, and instead just kind of pretends that these 14-year-olds would be totally okay with the fate of the world resting on their shoulders. So I really like what A Applegate does, but I'm not going to overly go into too much detail on them. I'm definitely going to be reading more of them as well over the next few weeks, because again, they're light, they're easy, they take all of about 2 hours, if that, and the real lovely palette cleanser between like more intense books. So those are all the fiction books that I read, and we're now going to discuss some of the non-fiction books that I read, again going from my favourite to my least favourite. A book that I absolutely adored and gave 9 out of 10 for was The Fossil Hunter by Shelley Emling. This I did as a buddy read with Natalie from Curious Reader, whose channel I will link down below. Hopefully she'll release her wrap up soon so she can talk about her thoughts in it as well. It was really fun chatting with her. The Fossil Hunter is a biography of the fossil collector and fossil hunter Mary Anning, who was around in the Victorian era and was finding fossils at the same time as like Darwin was releasing his Origins of Species, etc, etc. Mary Anning has very much been overlooked in history. None of her finds were particularly attributed to her, and instead various men in her life decided to take these finds and then gain from them in both scientific kind of accolades and reputation, as well as financially, although she did manage to make a semi-okay living by selling her finds to various museums and things. She is the person who discovered one of the very, very early examples of ichthyosaurs and other plesiosaurs, which are like underwater dinosaurs from the same time period as the dinosaur, and really her discoveries helped to put things like discussions of evolution and extinction on the map, and that acknowledgement that maybe the Earth was a lot older than what the Bible suggested. The book itself, I think, is absolutely fantastic. It really toes that line between giving you information about Mary Anning's life, but also to include enough of a wider context of what was going on historically to really ground her actions in kind of the wider picture. If you're someone who's interested in the history of ideas, even if you're not that bothered by Mary Anning, I would definitely recommend this book, because it does a real wonderful discussion of what was going on at the time for the great thinkers of the day, and how people were trying to understand these new discoveries that were coming up and try and rationalize them still within a framework of Christianity, and understanding these two very colliding thoughts. It's also really interesting to think that a lot of these ideas are only really 200 plus years old, if that in some cases, and yet we take them very much for granted now and the kind of sort of backlog of understood lore that they were really fighting against. The idea of something being able to go extinct is something that I definitely don't consider to be controversial, yet at its time it really rocked the foundations of how great learned men of the time really thought about the world. I do put emphasis on great learned men because, of course, it's a historical biography of a woman in a man's world, so therefore there's a hefty dose of sexism and kind of historical feminism to talk about there, so it's always worth bearing that in mind when going into this. One thing that was really appreciated by both Natalie and myself for this book was the fact that Shelley Emling made a really good point of making sure that the reader was aware when she was referring to things that were actually like had evidence and were known about Mary Anning, and where she was having to fill in the gaps based on other background information and just kind of generally assuming how one would feel in that particular position. A lot of the information we have on Mary Anning has been lost over the years or was never kept in the first place, and this is a real issue when trying to understand women in scientific thought and just kind of historically in the progress and like history of ideas, because a lot of their work just wasn't taken anywhere near as seriously, so it isn't recorded in the same way. So I think Shelley Emling did an amazing job with a really fascinating topic, and this is like a must read if you're interested in history of ideas, nature, natural history, anything sciencey based in the kind of leaning towards biology. The next one I want to talk about is Spook by Mary Roach. I read this as a buddy read with Olive back at the beginning of March, which feels like an absolute lifetime ago. I'll link her channel down below, as if you don't know Olive's channel. So Spook, Mary Roach is like a science writer who picks a particular topic and then goes into various details, and each one of her chapters is almost treated like a separate kind of subsection of this particular thing that she's exploring. In this particular book, she's looking at the science of the afterlife, and this probably is been my least favourite Mary Roach so far. Now, I'm a huge fan of Mary Roach. I consider her one of my favourite authors. She's fantastic. I really love most of her back catalogue, but this one for me just slightly missed the mark. I didn't think that there was as much science in it as normal, and her kind of snarky humour I don't think landed as strongly as it has done in other books. I think she works really well when it comes to like toilet humour and a lot of the slightly more immature silly side of humour, which, don't get me wrong, totally has its place, especially when we are talking about bodily functions. But with something as sensitive as the afterlife, where you are dealing with people's views and there's kind of some religious stuff going on in there as well, I just think she came across as a little flippant and a little cynical in places where she potentially could have been a bit more open-minded. I say that as someone who is super cynical about the afterlife and really just doesn't believe there's anything beyond the here and now. So for me to say that, I can't imagine like how frustrating it would be if you did kind of believe and were very passionate about afterlife. The historical stuff I found definitely more interesting than the modern day stuff, although there was the odd bit here or there that was kind of cool. And like, you know, it's a Mary Roach book, so I had a really good time with it, even though it's not one of my favourites of hers. So when I'm criticising it, I'm saying it is still like, it was still an excellent fun read that I totally enjoyed, and I think I gave like 7 or 8 stars, or out of 10. Sorry, I mark things out of 10. Yeah, I gave it 8 out of 10, but it's just something where I think other books of hers are stronger, so if you've not read a Mary Roach before, this might not be the best place to start. Another book that I've been really enjoying this month is Tamed, The 10 Species That Changed Our World by Alice Roberts. Now, I'm including this one even though I'm actually only halfway through, because my intention is to finish it either tonight or super early tomorrow, which means that I don't want to wait a month before I talk about it, so I'm just kind of chucking it in here now. So with all of this bearing in mind the caveat that I haven't actually technically finished it yet. Alice Roberts is an anthropologist, and this is a book looking at the 10 different species that we have domesticated or cultivated in some way that in doing so have kind of changed the course of human history. So it includes things like dogs, wheat, cattle, maize, potatoes, chickens, rice, horses, apples, and then human beings themselves. This is the book that had the Chickens of Tomorrow tagline, and I've just read the chapter on chickens and it was freaking fantastic, talking about the genetic modifications we can be doing to various animals, but mainly looking at chickens as a key example of this, and the history of the chicken and how the chicken as we know it today is really something that's only been around since kind of the very turn of the 20th century, based on competitions that were hosted for trying to find a better breed and create a better breed of chicken that was for meat purposes rather than for egg laying surveying purposes. So this book is really cool. It's a wonderful blend of like anthropology, archaeology and general kind of world history, as well as including some more modern day stuff, including things like the genetic modification, and making some kind of discussion about where we're going and the amount of input that human beings should be having into wild or indeed domesticated species, whether they be animal or plant, and the idea that we're playing around with forces that we don't fully understand. I'm assuming I'm probably going to give this something like a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 unless it manages to completely tank it at the end of this book. So this is going to be a new favourite and I would totally recommend it. Alice Roberts' writing style is really light and surprisingly easy, even though we're talking about some very dense technical things. They're talking about kind of the backlog of genetic material and how we can like trace the lineage of different plant species going through their genetics and all the different things that they've discovered in terms of like archaeological digs and stuff like that. So it is really going into a lot of detail in a very multidisciplinary way, but I think it's still surprisingly easy, and by breaking it into the different species, you've got real natural pause points where you can kind of stop and really absorb what you've been reading. So I have definitely been taking this over the past 2 days as like a specific chapter or section at a time, and then giving myself an opportunity to walk away, think about it, and then come back to it. Very, very cool. Another one that I read this month is The Man Who Loved Books Too Much by Allison Hoover Bartlett. This is about the industry of rare books and a particular gentleman who stole something like over £100,000 worth of rare books across his kind of crime career. This is falling into that subcategory of true crime, which is looking at non-violent crimes, normally heists or thefts of some sort, very much in a specific area which is valuable only to really the people who are involved in it. As with all of these books, I enjoyed the background far more than I enjoyed the information about the actual crime itself. Learning about the rare book world and how manuscripts work and kind of the value and how people source them and verify them, etc, etc. Totally fascinating. A clear, obvious one for any book lover out there, which if you're watching a channel like this, you're clearly a book lover, so I think you definitely enjoyed that side of things. But the actual crime itself, the criminal, was unbelievably annoying. I believe his name was John Gilkey. And he essentially is a moron, lacking any real better word. Gilkey's main reasons for theft seem to be that he doesn't understand the concept that property is a legitimate thing and that money is not dished out on basis of like want, and instead it is something that you do actually have to earn, and when you steal you are damaging something in some way. So for example, when he talks about the reasons why he stole all these books, it tends to stem from a thing of him saying, well, there's no way I'd be able to get them anyway because I don't earn enough, so it's not fair. That kept coming up over and over again. It's not fair that I can't have these books, so therefore I'm going to steal them. And bearing in mind the people that he was stealing from tended to be small shop owners who had really made this their life's passion, rather than some like big evil corporation who could kind of take the hit. Not that that makes it necessarily any better. He didn't really understand that he was genuinely damaging and harming people. He also at one point, it was just a real misguided thing, that he had a discussion with the author and he said that he had a degree in economics, and so from an economic standpoint stealing the books made far more financial sense because it meant that in the future if he needed to sell them on he'd get 100% of the profit. Technically speaking, he's not wrong, but that's not how economics should or does work. So I found him really annoying because of this. And I also found the author very irritating because she seemed to be spending a lot of time being very conflicted with when Gilkey was telling her information about crimes that he hadn't actually been caught for. Even when the like statute of limitations was up, she would feel more relieved about that fact because she then wasn't put in the awkward position of whether she needed to sell him out or not. And as somebody who I think has like, I don't know whether my moral compass is just skewed differently to hers, but that sat really weirdly with me, this idea that you could like willingly sit and listen to somebody regale you with tales of their theft and where they still have those items and not want to do something to try and make that fair. And then she kind of got a bit frustrated that other people in the book world were getting like, you know, shirty with her when she was willingly and knowingly associating with a criminal who had definitely stolen from most of them at some point. So the whole thing just felt a little bit to me. But the rare book stuff, very interesting, and it's a very quick read. It's quite short and the margins are huge in this book, so it's definitely one I'd suggest if you like the true crime in a non-violent way, then this could be a good book for you. Then I read The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin. I listened to this on audiobook and it's taken me about 6 weeks to get through it. Don't get me wrong, it's Charles Darwin's diaries from his 5-year expedition on the ship the Beagle, which took him across a variety of different islands, including Gibraltar, where he got to see the birds that then became the infamous kind of spark or idea for evolution as we know it, etc, etc. It was really interesting listening to Charles Darwin's writing. He's got an excellent writing style and it was very enjoyable in places, but it was also very racist in places, so it kind of became a bit of a weird mix. Basically, when Darwin was talking about plants or animals or indeed geology, it was really, really cool and fascinating, and I loved his various observations. When he was doing more of an anthropological discussion of the various people and societies he was meeting along the way, that was when it got really awkward and definitely a bit racist. Obviously, I know it's a product of its time, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's something that I really want to listen to, and unfortunately there seemed to be more of the anthropology than there was of the biology and botany stuff that I was really hoping to get from it. It's one that maybe if you were going to get it in book form, I'd suggest kind of skimming through, and if you're really, really into nature writing, I think there's still definitely going to be something in there for you, but just be aware going in that there are going to be several points you go, oh, white man said what? Yeah, awkward. And the last book that I have to talk about is my most disappointing book that I could talk about in this video, because there was one from the BookTube Prize that was even worse than this. Just a little mini spoiler alert for my next video, and that's The Prison Doctor by Dr. Amanda Brown. This is the story of a doctor who, like the title suggests, worked in several different prisons in Britain, and it was unbelievably dull, which you kind of figure, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you take something which should be at its heart very interesting, it's a doctor working in prisons, and then turn it into one of the most boring reads ever. And basically the frustrating thing I found about this book was I didn't learn anything as I went through it. When I approach a non-fiction, what I want from it is to come away from it feeling like I've actually learned something. For me, that's the real kind of point to non-fiction. It's not just about kind of jumping into somebody's head at random. I want to walk away feeling like my kind of knowledge base has been enriched in some way. So when it comes to a medical book, I'm really looking to learn about the medical processes that are involved in it. It's one of the reasons why I really enjoy reading lots of medical books, and I've read a fair number and have even more on my shelf. So that's what I was really expecting from this. Whereas actually this is just like a really, really repetitive look at kind of the prison system in a way that just didn't say anything or do anything. She would discuss things like the multiple cases of suicide or attempted suicide that she would be called out to in a code blue that she'd have to go and try and save. But then there wouldn't be any discussion about suicide rates in prisons or what was being done to try and help these people, or indeed kind of what process was happening in terms of, I know it sounds really creepy and morbid, but like how basically they were nearly dying and what she was doing to save them. There was discussions of increasing or decreasing people's drug doses based on trying to wean them off of their drug addictions, but there wasn't a discussion on this as a process, how well it works or not, the different ways that it can work in terms of like how it happens in the human body, etc, etc. There was nothing like that. It was just a repetition of her dishing out the same stuff over and over and over again, with almost no discussion of what was actually happening in kind of a broader scope in terms of like prisons in whole, or indeed a more in-depth look at like the medical stuff as a whole. And then this was cut together with the fact that every time she then was talking to anybody outside of her like prison life and her kind of job, there was this underlying sense of like, oh, my work that I do is just so much more important than yours, and like it was so hard at dinner parties to have conversations with people because it all just seemed so trivial compared to my work. Which the two combined just meant that this book was really irritating. If it was one where it was in a diary form and it had been like literally was her diary from her life, I could have maybe understood that, and then maybe some footnotes that expanded on these things. But it wasn't. It was her retrospectively looking back, which means that she had this opportunity to be able to research a bit more and add a bit more, and she actively chose not to do it. And honestly, this feels like a bit of a cash grab. This book came out around a similar time that Adam Kay's This Is Gonna Hurt came out, and there's been a few other relatively big GP doctory kind of books that have come out just before that, and I feel like this is really, from both her point of view and the publisher's point of view, a bit of a cash grab of saying, hey, do you know what sells really well? Books from doctors. Do you know what's really exciting? Prisons. Let's chuck these two together, bash this out, not worry about its content, and then sell a bunch. lunch. It failed to make any impact, and I really think give it a month and I'm gonna forget I read it, which is definitely not what I want from a book like that. So that's it from me. Those are all the books that I read in the month of March that I can talk to you about. Fingers crossed I'll be posting my BookTube prize wrap up fairly soon. I'm just waiting for the okay to say that the round is definitely over, everything's good, results are announced, and then I can release mine so I don't skew any of the judges' opinions. I am going to do round 2, fingers crossed, although I don't know if I'm definitely a judge or not yet. And obviously I have done my April TBR, which I'll link down below. April is looking like it's going to be a very, very good reading month because we're all inside and not allowed to leave our houses. So I should be getting plenty of reading done. So how are you doing? Are you holding up okay? What do you think to the books that I read? Are any of them now on your TBR? Just let's have a chat in the comments down below. Have a wonderful reading week and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!